All right, guys, so we've talked about respiration, which is the complete breakdown of a sugar source like glucose. And we talked about how it was that the electrons from breaking the bonds, oxidizing that glucose, could go into reducing ADP to ATP, so we get a lot of ATPs out of that, and how a lot of those electrons also were taken up by a final electron acceptor like oxygen. We recognize that anaerobic respiration could occur as well, where the final electron acceptor is actually something like a sulfate molecule or a nitrate molecule. Now let's take a look at fermentation. Fermentation is not a complete breakdown of the sugar source. Complete breakdown would be, an analogy might be eating a whole candy bar, right? It's all broken down. Fermentation would be a case where it's partially broken down, all right? So it's like breaking the candy bar in half and only eating some of it. But fermentation does give a certain amount of ATP. It does release a certain amount of ATP. And if a single-celled organism, an E. coli molecule, an E. coli bacterium, or some other bacterium of that size, they might be able to get by with smaller amounts of ATP, all right? And fermentation is basically the process of glycolysis. Now you may recall glycolysis is the first part of a respiration process, but it does not require oxygen, right? So fermentation does not need oxygen to progress. So you might have glucose, it's being broken down partially, and these are the characteristics of fermentation. One thing is that it releases energy from sugar or other organics, right? Well, the amount of energy is going to be less because it's just basically glycolysis, right? So we're looking at on the order of a couple of ATPs. This does not require oxygen. We just talked about that. And does not require the other parts of respiration, right? So we don't need the Krebs cycle electron transport chain to get the ATPs from the glucose with fermentation. Another difference is that fermentation uses an organic molecule as a final electron acceptor. With respiration, we had oxygen or a sulfate or a nitrate molecule. None of those were organic molecules, all right? In this case, it's an organic molecule that would be accepting the electrons. The organic molecules usually result in alcohol or acids being produced, all right? So some good examples of fermentation processes you need to know about that I'd like you to know as good examples would be lactic acid fermentation. We have lactic acid fermenters out there that will produce pyruvic acid as a result of glycolysis, just like any organism would do. But then that pyruvic acid is not further broken down, as in respiration. Instead, it's turned into lactic acid. And like I said, an organic molecule is the result. We have this lactic acid as a product of fermentation. Example of bacteria that do this, Streptococcus organisms make lactic acid in lactic acid fermentation, lactobacillus. These types of organisms are found in your yogurt. Okay, so the production of yogurt from milk is the result of the bacterial activity in the yogurt that are producing this particular acidic product. And the acids are what changes the whole look and feel to that product, right? It's no longer this liquid milk product. It turns into what we know as yogurt. And this is similar for sauerkraut, using cabbage to produce sauerkraut. Bacteria are involved. Pickles from cucumbers. Bacteria involved producing acids for those products that we consume. We also know that this is also a problematic process sometimes, and sometimes results in food spoilage, right? Now, another form of fermentation would be alcohol fermentation. This would be a situation where the pyruvic acid that half a candy bar, right, we're breaking down glucose using glycolysis, we're half breaking down that glucose molecule, and the pyruvic acids from that glucose are turned into alcohol. Okay? An example of an organism that does that is a yeast organism like Saccharomyces. Okay? And we use this sometimes in the production of beer, wine, and liquor, right? We actually harness the energy, harness the products of these organisms for our own use. We also see yeast being used in the process of producing bread, right? But in that case, we actually allow oxygen to get to these organisms, and we don't see the alcohol as a result. Okay, we see CO2 as a result. All right, so a big picture kind of idea you want to have when it comes to fermentation. Okay, we now know that a common product would be acids, like lactic acid, for example, and another common product would be alcohols. Sometimes you'll find CO2 as a product as well. Okay, so I don't need you to memorize all of these. These are just different organisms that are capable of fermentation. Okay, a lot of our organisms in the lab that we talked about with the metabolic plates, all of those different selective and differential plates, they are capable of fermentation. Okay, we see a whole list of different ones here. What I want you to notice are the commonalities. What's common when it comes to the end products of these fermentation processes. Okay, so the first thing I see is acid here that happens to be lactic acid. I see another mention of acid over here, a couple different kinds of acid that are produced. They're not lactic acid, but they're acids, right? We see some acids here. We see some acids here. So very common products are acids in the end of fermentation. Okay. So if I want to know if a particular nutrient source is being broken down, I might want to use an acid indicator, right? I want to use a pH indicator to show me that acids were produced, just like we're doing in lab. Okay? So one thing that's very common are acids. Another thing we see here is ethanol. That's an alcohol, right? We see another kind of alcohol here, isopropyl alcohol. I see another ethanol and another. And there's a mention of other kinds of alcohols below that, right? So acids are common, alcohols are common, and finally, we'll go to orange for this one, okay? I see CO2. Gases are produced, right? So if I want to, investigate whether an organism has the enzymes to allow it to ferment a particular nutrient source or particular sugar source, these are the things I want to look for. I want to look for the production of maybe alcohols or acids. I want to look for the production of gas, like CO2, right? Last thing I'll show you guys, and again, for this, I don't want you to memorize all of this, but I just want you to get, kind of feel the gravity of how many different kinds of products we actually get from fermentation over here on the left-hand column. Okay, lots of different things, and how it is that we've actually used these products over millennia. Okay, we've produced beer, we make fuel, we've even made some things that are pharmaceutical in use or industrial in their uses. Okay, we make cheese, sauerkraut, all these different food items, right? And Over here on the right, you can see which organisms actually produce those products. Again, I don't need you to memorize those organism names, but I definitely would want you to know some of the very common types of products of fermentation: alcohol, acids, gases like CO2, and definitely. Okay? So we'll leave it at that. We're pretty much done with metabolism, and we'll move on to growth. Definitely connected though, right? Because unless you are able to metabolize, you won't be growing, right? You won't be able to actually form bigger molecules and grow in size. All right.